It was 11:34 p.m. on Saturday, April 20th, 1935, when Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson walked out of the Red Rooster Bar on 125th Street, flanked by three bodyguards who'd been with him all evening while he conducted business with various policy operators. Johnson was 30 years old, already established as one of Harlem's rising criminal powers, someone whose intelligence and strategic thinking had earned him respect and enemies in equal measure. The evening had been routine: cards, bourbon, business discussions, and Johnson dismissed his security team at the entrance to the Red Rooster, telling them he'd walk the 50 feet to his Packard sedan alone, as he often did, confident that this stretch of 125th Street belonged to him, and that no one would dare approach him with hostile intentions on his own territory. What Johnson didn't know as he walked alone toward his car that April night was that someone had been waiting in the shadows for exactly this moment, the moment when Johnson's confidence made him vulnerable, when the man who controlled much of Harlem walked unprotected for 50 feet between a doorway and a vehicle. The man waiting wasn't one of Dutch Schultz's white enforcers. He was a black man named Thomas "Tommy" Wright, 28 years old, desperate and broke and hungry, who'd been offered $1,000 to kill Bumpy Johnson by an intermediary who worked for Schultz. $1,000 that could feed Wright's family for 6 months, $1,000 that Wright needed so badly that he'd agreed to murder a man he'd never met and had no quarrel with. According to 5 witnesses who were present on 125th Street that night, and who spoke with the Harlem Gazette between April 21st and April 23rd, 1935, what happened in the next 5 minutes became the most legendary display of Bumpy Johnson's genius for turning enemies into allies, for understanding human desperation, for recognizing that loyalty could be bought, but had to be bought properly, not through fear or coercion, but through understanding what people really needed and providing it in ways that transformed business transactions into bonds of brotherhood. Johnson was approximately 10 feet from his car, reaching into his pocket for his keys, when he heard a voice behind him say quietly but clearly, "Don't move, Bumpy. I got a gun pointed at your back." Johnson froze, hands still in his pockets, and slowly turned around, despite the instruction not to move. According to all 5 witnesses, Johnson's face showed no fear when he turned and saw the man standing 15 feet behind him, Thomas Wright, visibly nervous, holding a .38 caliber revolver pointed at Johnson's chest, with a hand that was shaking slightly, but that was steady enough to be deadly at that distance. The guy was clearly terrified, says Marcus Williams, 28, who was standing outside the Red Rooster and witnessed the entire confrontation. Williams spoke with the Gazette on April 22, 1935. His hand was shaking. He looked like he was about to throw up, but he had the gun pointed at Bumpy, and his finger was on the trigger. Everyone watching understood what was happening. We were watching a hit in progress. Some white gangster, probably Dutch Schultz, had hired a desperate black man to kill Bumpy Johnson. The desperate black man had actually gotten the drop on Bumpy, had him at gunpoint with no protection, and was maybe 2 seconds away from pulling the trigger and collecting whatever money he'd been promised. Johnson and Wright stared at each other in silence for approximately 5 seconds. Then Johnson did something that shocked everyone watching. He smiled slightly, took his hands slowly out of his pockets to show they were empty, and asked a question that would become the most famous 6 words ever spoken on a Harlem street corner. "How much are you being paid?" Wright hesitated, his gun still pointed at Johnson's chest, confusion visible on his face, because this wasn't how he'd expected the interaction to go. The man he was supposed to kill was asking about his compensation rather than begging for his life or trying to escape or reaching for his own weapon. $1,000, Wright stammered, according to witnesses who heard the exchange clearly. "They're paying me $1,000 to kill you." Johnson nodded slowly, as if considering this information carefully, and then his face broke into a wider smile, not mocking or cruel, but genuinely impressed, according to witnesses who saw his expression. $1,000, Johnson repeated. "They're paying you $1,000 to kill Bumpy Johnson. That's insulting to both of us, brother. Insulting to me because my life is worth a lot more than $1,000, and insulting to you because you're risking your life and your soul for $1,000 when your services are worth much more than that to the right employer." Johnson paused, let that statement settle, and then delivered the sentence that changed everything. "I'll pay you $5,000 if you join my crew. Right. Now, tonight. Put the gun down and work for me instead of killing me." According to all witnesses, Wright's face showed complete shock. His gun wavered, the barrel dropping slightly as his arm weakened from the surprise of what he'd just heard. "Schultz wants a black man to kill a black man," Johnson continued, his voice calm and conversational, as if he weren't standing 15 feet from a loaded gun. "That's not happening. Not tonight. Not ever. So here's what's going to happen instead. You're going to put that gun down, you're going to take $5,000 from me, and tomorrow morning you're going to meet me at this exact spot, and we're going to have a conversation about why you needed $1,000 badly enough to agree to murder a stranger. And then you're going to work for me. Does that sound like a better deal than shooting me and collecting $1,000 from whoever hired you?" Wright stood frozen, his gun now pointed at the ground, his mouth opening and closing without words coming out, clearly unable to process what was happening. At that moment, Johnson's three bodyguards, William "Bub" Hewlett, Samuel "Big Sam" Jackson, and Marcus "Quick" Davis, burst out of the Red Rooster where they'd been waiting just inside the door. All three had weapons drawn and pointed at Wright within seconds, surrounding him from three directions, ready to fire the instant Johnson gave the signal. "We got him, boss!" Hewlett shouted. "Drop the gun or you're dead!" But Johnson held up his hand, stopping his security team before they could shoot Wright or disarm him forcibly. "Drop your weapons," Johnson said calmly to his own bodyguards. "This man isn't a threat. He's a businessman who's about to change employers. Drop your weapons. Now!" The three bodyguards stared at Johnson in confusion, their guns still pointed at Wright. "Boss, this man just tried to kill you," Jackson protested. "We got him dead to rights. Let us handle this." "I said drop your weapons," Johnson repeated, his voice still, calm, but now carrying an edge of command that made clear this wasn't a suggestion. "And somebody give me $5,000. Cash. Right now." The bodyguards slowly lowered their weapons, still confused, still watching Wright carefully in case he tried something. Hewlett reached into his jacket and pulled out a thick envelope, money that had been collected from various policy operations earlier that evening, and that was meant to be delivered to Johnson's office for counting and distribution. Hewlett counted out $5,000, hands moving automatically while his brain struggled to understand why his boss was about to give a fortune to the man who'd just tried to murder him. Johnson took the money from Hewlett, walked slowly toward Wright, who stood paralyzed, unable to decide whether to raise his gun again or run or simply surrender, and extended the cash toward him. "Take it," Johnson said quietly. "Tomorrow morning, 9 a.m., right here. You and me. We talk. You tell me your story. I decide whether you work for me or not. But either way, you keep this $5,000. Consider it payment for not pulling that trigger tonight. Consider it an investment in your future. Consider it proof that working with me pays better than working against me. Take the money and go home. Take care of whatever problem you've got, that made you desperate enough to agree to kill someone. And tomorrow, we talk about whether you've got what it takes to work in my organization." Wright slowly reached out and took the envelope of cash, his hand shaking so badly now that he nearly dropped it. He looked at Johnson, looked at the 3 bodyguards who were watching with expressions somewhere between confusion and anger, looked back at Johnson. "Thank you," Wright whispered, tears beginning to stream down his face. "Thank you. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. I needed. Thank you." "Tomorrow," Johnson said simply. 9 a.m. Don't be late. Now go home." Wright backed away slowly, still holding the gun in one hand and the envelope of cash in the other, unable to believe what had just happened, unable to process that the man he'd been sent to kill had instead given him 5 times the money he'd been promised for committing murder. When Wright was approximately 20 feet away, he turned and ran, disappearing into the darkness of Harlem's streets, while Johnson and his 3 shocked bodyguards watched him go. The car ride home. He's brave, he needs money, and he follows orders. According to William Hewlett, who spoke with the Gazette on April 23, 1935, the car ride back to Johnson's apartment that night was one of the strangest conversations he'd ever had with his boss. The 3 bodyguards were furious with themselves for allowing someone to get so close to Johnson with a weapon, confused about why Johnson had paid the would-be assassin instead of having him killed, and worried that Johnson had made a terrible mistake that would cost him his life when Wright returned the next morning to finish what he'd started. "We were all talking at once," Hewlett recalls. "Sam was saying we should go find the guy and take the money back and kill him before he could tell whoever hired him that the hit had failed. Quick was saying we'd failed at our jobs by letting someone get close enough to point a gun at Bumpy. I was saying I didn't understand why Bumpy had given $5,000 to someone who'd been hired to kill him. We were all upset and confused and trying to figure out what had just happened." Johnson sat quietly in the back seat of the Packard while his bodyguards drove and argued, letting them vent their frustration and confusion for several minutes before finally interrupting them with a single sentence that, according to Hewlett, completely changed how all 3 bodyguards understood what had happened on 125th Street. "He's a brave man. He needs money, and he follows orders without caring who gives them. Those are exactly the qualities I look for in people I employ. Now I want him in my crew." The car went silent as the 3 bodyguards processed what Johnson had said. "And every time I look at him," Johnson continued, "I'll remember how close to death he got me tonight. I'll remember that I need to improve my security, that I can't walk alone even 50 feet on my own territory, that there are desperate men out there who'll kill for $1,000, no matter how much power I have or how much territory I control. That man taught me a valuable lesson tonight. He reminded me that I'm not invincible. That's worth $5,000. According to Hewlett, this explanation stunned all 3 bodyguards because it revealed how Johnson thought about threats, about loyalty, about the value of turning enemies into allies rather than simply eliminating enemies. Bumpy saw something in that desperate guy with the shaking gun that we didn't see, Hewlett explains. We saw a threat that needed to be eliminated. Bumpy saw a man who was brave enough to approach him with a weapon, desperate enough to accept a murder contract for only $1,000, and obedient enough to follow orders from strangers. Bumpy understood that those qualities made the guy potentially valuable, more valuable alive and working for us than dead. And Bumpy understood that paying him $5,000 instead of the $1,000 he'd been promised would create intense loyalty because the guy would understand that Bumpy valued him more than whoever had hired him to commit murder. It was brilliant psychology. Bumpy turned a threat into an asset, turned a man who was trying to kill him into a man who would die for him, all because Bumpy understood what the guy really needed and was willing to provide it in a way that transformed their relationship from enemies to allies. Sunday morning, April 21st, 1935. I have a daughter and a son who don't have food. At 8:55 a.m. on Sunday morning, April 21st, 1935, Thomas Wright appeared outside the Red Rooster Bar on 125th Street, 5 minutes early for his 9 a.m. meeting with Bumpy Johnson. Wright was clean-shaven, wearing his best suit, threadbare but pressed, and holding the envelope containing the $5,000 Johnson had given him the night before. Wright looked nervous but determined, like a man who understood he'd been given an incredible opportunity and who was terrified of doing anything that might cause him to lose it. Johnson arrived exactly at 9 a.m., again flanked by his 3 bodyguards who positioned themselves nearby, but who gave Johnson and Wright space to talk privately. Johnson shook Wright's hand, a gesture that clearly surprised Wright, who'd expected something more formal or cold, and then suggested they walk together down 125th Street while they talked. According to Hewlett, who walked behind Johnson and Wright at a distance of approximately 20 feet, and who could hear parts of their conversation, Wright began explaining his situation immediately. "My name is Thomas Wright. I'm 28 years old. I've lived in Harlem my whole life. I've worked every legitimate job I could find: porter, janitor, construction laborer. When construction was available, anything that would pay money. But in April 1935 in Harlem, there aren't any jobs. The Depression has destroyed everything. White people won't hire black men for anything except the very worst jobs at the very lowest pay. And even those jobs are impossible to get because 100 men apply for every position that opens up." Wright paused, his voice breaking slightly, and then continued according to Hewlett's account. "I have a daughter who's 7 years old and a son who's 5 years old. They haven't had a proper meal in 3 weeks. We're eating bread and water because that's all I can afford. My wife is sick. She has pneumonia. She needs medicine that costs $40, and I don't have $40. I don't have $10. I don't have $1. I've sold everything we own that has any value. I've borrowed money from everyone who would lend to me. I've begged for work everywhere that might hire me. And I've failed. I'm failing as a father and as a husband because I can't feed my children or get medicine for my wife." According to Hewlett, Wright was crying openly by this point, but continued talking through his tears. "3 days ago, a man I don't know approached me on the street. He said he'd heard I needed money. He said he had a job that would pay $1,000. He said the job was simple: kill Bumpy Johnson. I asked who was paying for the hit. He said it didn't matter who was paying, just that the money was guaranteed if I completed the job. I asked why they wanted you dead. He said it didn't matter why, just that you needed to be dead, and they'd pay $1,000 to whoever made that happen." Wright wiped his eyes and looked directly at Johnson, according to Hewlett's description. "I want you to understand something, Mr. Johnson. I don't know Dutch Schultz. I've never met him. I don't work for him. I don't know anything about policy gambling or territory disputes or criminal organizations. I'm not a criminal. I'm just a desperate man who needs money to feed his children and get medicine for his wife. The man who approached me might work for Schultz, or he might work for someone else entirely. I don't know, and I didn't ask. All I knew was that $1,000 would solve my immediate problems, would feed my family for 6 months, would get medicine for my wife. So I said yes. I said I'd kill a man I'd never met because I needed the money badly enough that I'd do anything to get it." Johnson listened to all of this in silence, according to Hewlett, his face showing no emotion until Wright finished speaking. Then Johnson stopped walking, turned to face Wright directly, and extended his hand for Wright to shake. "From now on, you work for me, and not anybody else," Johnson said clearly enough that Hewlett heard every word. "Not Dutch Schultz, not whoever approached you 3 days ago, not any other criminal organization in Harlem or anywhere else. You work for me exclusively. You follow my orders. You do what I tell you to do. You're loyal to me and to this organization, and in exchange, I pay you better than anyone else would pay you. I make sure your family has food and medicine and everything else they need. And I give you work that has meaning beyond just collecting a paycheck. Do you hear me? Do you understand what I'm offering you and what I'm demanding from you?" According to Hewlett, Wright began crying again, not from despair this time, but from relief and gratitude. Wright grabbed Johnson's hand with both of his hands, shaking it vigorously, while tears streamed down his face. "I understand, Mr. Johnson. I swear to you I'll be loyal. I'll work harder than anyone you've ever employed. I'll do whatever you need me to do. I'll prove that you made the right decision giving me this chance. Thank you. Thank you for not killing me last night when you had every right to kill me. Thank you for giving me money I didn't deserve. Thank you for offering me work when I'd come to kill you. Thank you for understanding why I did what I did. I won't forget this. I'll spend the rest of my life proving I deserved your mercy and your generosity." Johnson nodded, pulled his hand back gently from Wright's grasp, and then put his hand on Wright's shoulder in a gesture that Hewlett describes as almost fatherly. "Go home," Johnson said. "Take care of your wife, feed your children, use that $5,000 to solve your immediate problems. Tomorrow morning, 9 a.m., you report to William Hewlett. That's him standing 20 feet behind us watching this conversation. Hewlett will give you your first assignments. You'll start as a collector, walking routes and picking up policy money from our runners. It's simple work, but it's important work, and it pays $40 per week, which is more than you'd earn doing almost any legitimate job available to black men in 1935. You do that work well, you'll get more responsibility and more money. You prove yourself valuable, you'll move up in the organization. You prove yourself loyal, you'll have a job for as long as you want one. Understand?" "I understand, Mr. Johnson," Wright said, still crying. "Thank you. I'll prove myself. I promise." Johnson nodded once more, then turned and walked back toward his car, while Wright stood motionless on 125th Street, watching the man whose life he'd been paid to end, the man who'd instead given him money and work and hope, the man who'd seen past the gun and the murder contract to understand the desperation and the need that had created both. Thomas "Tommy" Wright worked for Bumpy Johnson from April 1935 until Wright's death from a heart attack in 1962, 27 years during which Wright became one of Johnson's most trusted associates, eventually managing significant parts of Johnson's policy operations and earning a reputation as someone whose loyalty was absolute, because he never forgot the night Bumpy Johnson could have killed him, but instead gave him $5,000 and a job. Tommy Wright became one of Bumpy's key people, says Theodore Green, Johnson's attorney who spoke with the Gazette on April 23, 1935. Bumpy trusted Wright with important responsibilities, managing collections, supervising runners, handling money, negotiating with other operators. Wright proved his loyalty repeatedly over 27 years, and Bumpy rewarded that loyalty with increasing responsibility and increasing pay. By the 1950s, Wright was earning more than most legitimate businessmen in Harlem, and he was doing work that he believed in because Bumpy had taught him that there was meaning in standing with your own people rather than betraying them for whoever offered the most money. But Wright's transformation from would-be assassin to loyal lieutenant had significance beyond his personal story. Wright became living proof of Johnson's philosophy about loyalty, about understanding what people needed, about the value of mercy and strategic generosity over immediate violence. Everyone in Bumpy's organization knew the story of Tommy Wright and the gun he didn't fire, says Hewlett. Bumpy made sure everyone knew it because the story illustrated important lessons. That loyalty can be bought if you buy it properly, that understanding what people need gives you power over them in ways that fear never provides, that mercy can be more strategic than violence when mercy transforms enemies into allies. New recruits to Bumpy's organization were told about Tommy Wright. Were told to notice that one of Bumpy's top lieutenants was a man who'd once been hired to kill Bumpy, but who'd instead become his most loyal soldier because Bumpy had understood what Wright needed and had provided it in ways that created a bond stronger than money could create by itself. Wright reportedly kept the .38 caliber revolver he'd pointed at Johnson on April 20th, 1935, displayed in his home as a reminder of the night his life changed, the night he'd been ready to commit murder for $1,000, and had instead received $5,000 and mercy and opportunity from the man he'd been sent to kill. Wright would show the gun to his children and later to his grandchildren, telling them about Bumpy Johnson's intelligence and generosity and strategic brilliance, teaching them that sometimes mercy is more powerful than violence, and that understanding what people need is more valuable than knowing how to hurt them. The question that became legend: how much are you being paid? The 6 words Bumpy Johnson spoke to Thomas Wright on April 20th, 1935, "How much are you being paid?" became the most famous question ever asked on a Harlem street corner. Witnesses who heard the question repeated it to others, who repeated it to others, spreading throughout Harlem during the spring and summer of 1935, until everyone in Harlem's criminal underworld knew the story of the man who'd been hired to kill Bumpy Johnson for $1,000 and who'd been hired instead by Bumpy Johnson for $5,000 because Johnson understood that loyalty could be purchased but had to be purchased properly. What made that question so brilliant was how it reframed everything, says Green. Wright had a gun pointed at Bumpy. Wright held all the power in that moment. He could kill Bumpy and collect his money, or he could spare Bumpy for reasons of mercy or fear. But the instant Bumpy asked, "How much are you being paid?" the power dynamic shifted completely. Suddenly it wasn't about whether Wright would kill Bumpy. It was about whether Wright was being paid enough to kill Bumpy, whether the compensation matched the task, whether Wright was being valued properly by his employer. That question made Wright think about his situation differently, made him realize he was being underpaid for the risk he was taking and the act he was committing. And once Wright admitted he was only getting $1,000, Bumpy could offer more and could make Wright understand that working for Bumpy was a better deal than killing Bumpy. The story of Johnson's question and his $5,000 offer became required learning for criminals throughout Harlem. Policy operators who competed with Johnson for territory learned that trying to hire assassins to kill Johnson was pointless because Johnson could outbid them and turn their assassins into his employees. Young criminals who wanted to work in organized crime learned that Bumpy Johnson paid better than other employers and that loyalty to Johnson meant loyalty for life, because Johnson never forgot who'd stood with him and who'd stood against him. That question, "How much are you being paid?" became shorthand for a whole philosophy about loyalty and employment and understanding what motivates people, says Reverend James Thompson, 58, a Harlem minister who knew Johnson and who spoke with the Gazette on April 22, 1935. Bumpy understood that most people aren't evil. They're desperate. Most people don't want to hurt others. They want to survive and provide for their families. If you understand that desperation, If you understand what people really need beyond just money, you can turn enemies into allies by providing what they need in ways that create bonds stronger than fear or coercion could ever create. That was Bumpy's genius. He understood human nature better than most criminals understood it, and he used that understanding to build an organization where people were loyal, not just because they were afraid of Bumpy, but because they genuinely believed Bumpy cared about them and would take care of them if they took care of him. The lesson for Bumpy's security: I was one step away from being dead. Johnson's near-death experience on April 20th, 1935 changed how he thought about security for the rest of his life. According to multiple associates, Johnson never again walked alone even short distances on Harlem streets, never dismissed his bodyguards casually, never assumed that his reputation or his power made him invulnerable to assassination attempts by desperate men who needed money badly enough to risk attacking someone more powerful than themselves. After Tommy Wright, Bumpy took security much more seriously, says Hewlett. Bumpy realized that all the power in the world doesn't protect you from a desperate man with a gun if you make yourself vulnerable even for 50 feet between a doorway and a car. Bumpy upgraded his security. More bodyguards, better planning, less predictable patterns, and Bumpy kept Tommy Wright close partly because looking at Wright reminded Bumpy every day that he'd been one step away from being dead, that he'd gotten lucky when Wright hesitated long enough for Bumpy to ask his question. That luck runs out eventually if you rely on it too often. Wright became a living reminder to Bumpy and to everyone in Bumpy's organization that you're never safe, never invincible, never beyond the reach of violence, no matter how powerful you become. Dutch Schultz's response to learning that his $1,000 assassin had instead been hired by Bumpy Johnson for $5,000 was reportedly a mixture of rage and grudging respect. According to sources who were present when Schultz learned what had happened, Schultz was furious that his hit had failed, but impressed by Johnson's strategic thinking in recognizing that paying more than the assassination contract was worth transformed an enemy into an ally. Schultz understood he'd been outmaneuvered, says Detective Raymond Murphy of the New York Police Department, who investigated organized crime in Harlem and who spoke with the Gazette on April 24, 1935. Schultz had tried to use the cheapest possible method to eliminate Johnson, hiring a desperate man for minimal money and hoping desperation would be sufficient motivation for murder. But Bumpy understood that desperation cuts both ways, that desperate men are loyal to whoever pays them best rather than to whoever hires them first. By offering 5 times what Schultz was paying, Bumpy turned Schultz's assassin into his own employee and sent a message to every other potential assassin. Killing Bumpy Johnson pays less than working for Bumpy Johnson. That message made it much harder for Schultz to hire reliable people to work against Johnson's interests. Schultz reportedly never attempted another assassination contract against Johnson after the Tommy Wright failure. By October 1935, 6 months after Wright's failed hit, Schultz was dead, killed by hitmen working for Lucky Luciano and the Commission, eliminating the primary threat to Harlem's independent policy operators and allowing Johnson to consolidate his control over territories Schultz had been trying to seize. In Harlem today, elderly residents who remember the 1930s still tell the story of the night Bumpy Johnson faced down a would-be assassin by asking one simple question about money, then turned that assassin into one of his most loyal soldiers by paying more than the assassination contract was worth. The story has been told and retold for decades, becoming legend, becoming myth, becoming the definitive example of Bumpy Johnson's intelligence and his understanding that loyalty is more valuable than violence when you know how to create it properly. The question, "How much are you being paid?" became the most famous 6 words Bumpy Johnson ever spoke, more enduring than any threats he made to rivals, more memorable than any boasts about wealth or power, more influential than any orders he gave to his organization, because those 6 words demonstrated something fundamental about intelligence and strategy that most criminals never understood, that understanding what motivates people, providing what they need in ways that create bonds of loyalty, turning enemies into allies through strategic generosity rather than killing enemies through immediate violence. These capabilities made you more powerful than guns, or fear could make you, more secure than bodyguards could make you, more successful than brutality could make you. Thomas Wright lived for 27 years after pointing a gun at Bumpy Johnson on April 20th, 1935. He raised his children, cared for his wife, earned good money doing work that gave him dignity, and never forgot the night a man whose life he'd been paid to end instead gave him money and mercy and opportunity. And Bumpy Johnson lived for 33 more years after facing death at Thomas Wright's hands, building an empire that lasted decades, becoming the most powerful and most respected criminal in Harlem's history, never forgetting the lesson Wright taught him, that you're never invincible, never beyond the reach of desperate men with weapons, never safe unless you understand that security comes not just from bodyguards and guns, but from understanding human nature well enough to turn would-be killers into brothers. That was the meaning of April 20th, 1935. That was the lesson of 6 words that changed Harlem forever. That was the question that stopped a bullet and started a legend about mercy being more strategic than murder when you understand what people need and provide it in ways that transform enemies into family.